23 children were found locked in the basement of a Georgia plantation in 1864. All of them shared the same haunting features: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, auburn hair streaked with gold. When Union soldiers forced open the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, they discovered these children huddled together in complete darkness. Some were as young as 4. Others were approaching adolescence. They had been living underground like animals, hidden away from a world that was never supposed to find them. The eldest among them was a girl of 13. When the soldiers asked her why they were locked away, she spoke words that made battle-hardened veterans physically ill. She said, "Mistress told us we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Her blood. Military records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry mention this incident only once, buried in a letter marked confidential that remained hidden in regimental archives for over a century. Local histories of Burke County omit Thornhill Estate entirely, as if the plantation and its mistress never existed. But they did exist. And what Catherine Thornhill created during those 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops remains one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. A systematic breeding program designed to create generations of enslaved people who could never escape their bondage because they were genetically tied to their owner. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, you are welcome. I want to know where you are watching from today. Drop your country in the comments and let me know if you have ever heard a story this dark from American history. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss these hidden stories they refuse to teach in schools. Now let us go back to where this nightmare began, to a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. Thornhill Estate sat on 1,700 acres of red clay soil, 7 miles southwest of Waynesboro. In 1847, Burke County was cotton country, though not as prosperous as the Black Belt regions further west. The soil was tired and overworked for decades of single-crop farming. Plantations that had flourished in the 1820s were struggling by the 1840s, squeezed between falling cotton prices and rising costs. Thornhill Estate had once been successful. Catherine's late husband, Jonathan Thornhill, had inherited it from his father in 1838 with 42 enslaved workers, adequate equipment, and manageable debt. But Jonathan had been a poor manager and an enthusiastic gambler. By the time winter fever claimed him in February of 1847, the estate was mortgaged beyond recovery. The fields barely produced enough to feed the workers, and creditors circled like vultures. Catherine was 28 when she became a widow. She had married Jonathan at 19 in a strategic match arranged by her father, Theodore Danforth, a prominent merchant in Augusta. The Danforths were old Georgia money, descended from settlers who arrived in the 1730s. She had been educated by private tutors, spoke French passably well, and had been raised to manage a substantial household. What she had not expected was inheriting a failing plantation with crushing debts and a 16-year-old stepson who looked at her with something approaching hatred. Richard Barnhill was Jonathan's son from his first marriage. His mother had died giving birth to him in 1831, and Jonathan remarried 6 years later. Richard never warmed to Catherine, viewing her as an interloper who replaced his real mother. Catherine found him weak, impractical, and entirely too sentimental. He once suggested the enslaved workers should be taught to read. Catherine forbade him from ever speaking of it again. The plantation reflected its declining fortunes. The main house was a 2-story structure of whitewashed brick with 6 columns across the front, built in 1805. Paint peeled from the window frames. The roof leaked in 3 places. Behind the house stood the kitchen building, smokehouse, dairy, and overseer's cottage, all in similar disrepair. In 1847, 31 people remained enslaved on the property, 11 men, 13 women, and 7 children. 16 others had already been sold to satisfy Jonathan's creditors. Those who remained knew more sales were coming. Fear hung over the quarters like fog over the Savannah River. Catherine spent the first month after Jonathan's death in controlled fury. She met with the estate's lawyer, Ambrose Talbot, who laid out her options bluntly. She could sell everything to settle debts and live modestly in Augusta under her father's house, living as a dependent spinster in her father's house, forever marked as the widow who could not hold on to her inheritance. But traditional plantation management would not save Thornhill Estate either. The land was worn out. The equipment was old. The remaining workers were insufficient to work the fields profitably, and she had no money to purchase more. It was during one of those sleepless nights poring over account books by candlelight that Catherine conceived her plan. The idea came with the cold logic of desperation. If she could not afford to purchase workers, she would breed them, but not in a haphazard way most plantations did, offering minor incentives for couples to have children and waiting 15 years for productivity. Catherine envisioned something far more systematic, more controlled. She would create a population of workers biologically tied to the estate, workers who could never be sold because they were her own descendants, workers who would have instinctive loyalty because it was literally in their blood. The plan was monstrous, but to Catherine, it was elegant.
Catherine began keeping a journal to work out the details of her plan. This was no diary of personal feelings. Catherine was far too practical for sentiment. Instead, she created what she called her cultivation records, filled with calculations, observations, and timelines. She wrote in a simple substitution cipher, replacing key words with innocuous agricultural terms. Children became seedlings. The men she selected became rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. Births were harvests. The journal pages were covered with diagrams that looked like breeding charts for livestock, because that is essentially what they were. Catherine's first selection was a man named Isaac. He was 24 years old, born on the plantation, known for his physical strength and steady temperament. She summoned him to the main house on a March evening in 1847, after the other workers had retired to the quarters. What happened that night was recorded in Catherine's journal with chilling detachment. She wrote only, "First planting completed with rootstock 1. Weather clear and mild." 3 weeks later, she summoned him again, then twice more before the month ended. By April, Catherine was confident she was pregnant. She recorded this with the same emotional distance she might note the planting of cotton. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. Let me ask you something. What kind of mind thinks this way? What kind of person reduces human life to agricultural terminology and breeding charts? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think was truly driving Catherine Thornhill. Richard Thornhill first suspected something was wrong in late May of 1847. He noticed Catherine had stopped taking her morning rides around the property. She claimed the heat bothered her, even though the Georgia summer had barely begun. She took meals in her room more frequently and dismissed the house servant who usually attended her. For a woman as concerned with appearances as Catherine, this withdrawal was unusual. But it was a conversation Richard overheard in early June that truly alarmed him. He had been hidden in the library behind one of the tall bookcases when Catherine met with Miriam Grayson in the adjacent parlor. Mrs. Grayson was the local midwife, a sharp-featured woman of 50 who attended births throughout Burke County. She had a reputation as a skilled practitioner who asked few questions and kept confidences. "You are certain of your condition?" Mrs. Grayson asked. "Quite certain," Catherine replied. "Sometime in early December." "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said?" There was a pause. Richard pressed himself against the bookcase, hardly breathing. "My late husband and I were intimate in January," Catherine said evenly, "shortly before his final illness." "Of course," Mrs. Grayson's voice carried careful neutrality. "I will need to examine you properly. Will you want me at the house for the delivery?" "I will. And I will need your discretion, Miriam. Absolutely." "You have it, as always." Richard waited until both women left before emerging from his hiding place. His hands were shaking. The mathematics did not work. His father had been bedridden for the entire month of January, barely conscious most days, racked with fever and chills. He had sat with him many nights. There had been no possibility of intimate relations between his father and Catherine, which meant the child Catherine was carrying had been conceived after Jonathan's death, in March or April, with someone else. The implications made Richard sick. If word spread that Catherine had conceived out of wedlock, the scandal would destroy the family's reputation. Creditors would seize the property immediately. The Danforth family would disown her. But beyond practical consequences, Richard was appalled by the deception itself. Catherine intended to claim this child as his father's legitimate heir, to lie to everyone, to build her future on fraud. He considered his options. Confronting Catherine directly seemed futile. He was only 16, and she held all legal authority. Going to lawyer Talbert without proof would be his word against hers. Writing to his grandfather in Augusta was impossible, since Catherine read all outgoing mail. Instead, Richard began watching Catherine carefully, looking for evidence, trying to understand her plan. He noticed Catherine summoned Isaac to the main house regularly, always after dark, always when the overseer was away. He saw how Catherine's manner toward Isaac differed from her treatment of other enslaved workers. Not kind, exactly, but less hostile. She spoke to him in full sentences rather than curt commands. By July, Richard was certain Isaac was the father. The realization filled him with horror. Catherine had coldly, deliberately chosen to conceive a child with an enslaved man, claim that child as her late husband's heir, and maintain this lie indefinitely. What kind of woman was capable of such calculated deception? He found part of the answer in early August. During one of Catherine's trips to Waynesboro, Richard searched for legal documents in her study. He had vague thoughts of finding leverage against her. Instead, he discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a locked drawer of her writing desk. The lock was simple enough for a determined 16-year-old to pick. The journal was written in cipher, But Richard had always been good with puzzles. It took him 3 days, working in secret whenever Catherine was away, to crack the substitution pattern. What he read made his blood run cold. Catherine was not just having an affair with Isaac. She was implementing a deliberate breeding program. The journal laid it out in chilling detail. Her plan to conceive multiple children with selected enslaved men, to raise those children as part of the plantation workforce, to eventually breed those children with each other and with other enslaved people to create an ever-expanding population genetically tied to Thornhill Estate and to Catherine herself. There were charts, calculations of expected births over 5-year periods, notes on which men displayed desirable physical characteristics, speculation about whether traits like strength, intelligence, and temperament were heritable. It read like something from a livestock breeder's manual, except the livestock were human beings. Richard copied several pages, translating the cipher into plain English. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold the pen. This was evidence. This was proof of Catherine's depravity. He could take this to the authorities. He could expose her. But that night at dinner, Catherine looked at him with those cold green eyes. "Richard," she said casually, "have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem disturbed." "No, ma'am," Richard lied, his throat tight. "I keep certain documents locked away for good reason," Catherine cut her meat with precise strokes. "If I ever found someone had violated my privacy, broken my trust in such a fundamental way, I would have to take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Because family loyalty is everything, Richard, everything. Without it, we are simply animals tearing at each other." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "I know you loved your father very much. I would hate for his memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal emerging from within his own household." The threat was unmistakable. If Richard tried to expose Catherine, she would turn it back on him, paint him as a disturbed, resentful stepson, inventing lies about a grieving widow. Who would believe? A respected plantation mistress from a prominent family? Or an awkward teenage boy with known resentment towards his stepmother? Richard returned to his room that night and burned the pages he had copied. But he kept watching. And then he began to feel unwell.
It started with fatigue. By September of 1847, Richard found himself exhausted by mid-afternoon, unable to focus on his books. His appetite diminished. He developed frequent headaches that made it difficult to think clearly. By October, he was experiencing muscle weakness and occasional stomach pains. Catherine showed great concern. She insisted Richard stay in bed. She prepared his meals herself, bringing him bowls of soup and plates of soft foods. She summoned Mrs. Grayson to examine him. The midwife diagnosed nervous exhaustion, complicated by possible consumption. She prescribed rest, fresh air when Richard felt strong enough, and a special tonic that Catherine obtained from a pharmacy in Augusta. Tuberculosis often strikes young men of sensitive disposition, Catherine told Richard, adjusting his pillows with attentive care. "Your father had a cousin who died of it at just your age. We must be very vigilant." Richard knew better. He had read about arsenic poisoning during his hours in the library. He recognized the symptoms in himself: the fatigue, the digestive troubles, the muscle weakness, the way each meal left him weaker than before. Catherine was slowly killing him, disguising murder as disease, eliminating the one person who knew her secret and posed a threat to her plans. But Richard was too weak to fight back, too isolated to get help. The house servants followed Catherine's orders absolutely. The overseer rarely came to the main house. Richard's room was on the second floor, and by November he barely had the strength to get out of bed, let alone escape the property and reach Waynesboro.
He made one final attempt to expose Catherine in late November. Working for a few minutes at a time before exhaustion overwhelmed him, Richard spent 3 days composing a letter to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta. He described Catherine's breeding program, her journal, the poisoning. He sealed the letter and gave it to one of the younger house servants, a girl named Pearl, begging her to post it in Waynesboro without telling Catherine. Pearl took the letter, but she also told Catherine. The girl was terrified of what would happen if the mistress discovered she had been keeping secrets. Her fear of Catherine was greater than her sympathy for Richard. Catherine read the letter expressionless. Then she burned it in the fireplace in front of Richard. "You are very ill, darling," she said softly, almost tenderly. "The fever is affecting your mind. You are imagining things that are not real." She paused, watching the flames consume his last hope. "It is a mercy, really, that you will not have to suffer much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3, 1847, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. Dr. Samuel Pritchard from Waynesboro was summoned to record the death. He noted consumption as the cause and remarked that the young man had wasted away with tragic speed. Catherine wept decorously at the funeral. She wore black for a full year. 4 days after Richard's burial, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son. She named him Jonathan after her late husband and claimed he had been born slightly premature. This explained any questions about timing. Few people in Burke County thought to count backwards from the birth to Catherine's widowhood. Those who did kept their speculations to themselves. It was not the kind of thing one discussed openly. Now I need to pause here and ask you something. Do you think Pearl made the right choice? She was enslaved, terrified, with no power of her own. Could she have saved Richard? Or was she just another victim of Catherine's web? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. With Richard gone and her first child born, Catherine moved forward with her plan. The years between 1848 and 1856 transformed Thornhill Estate in ways that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. The plantation that had teetered on bankruptcy slowly regained its footing. Cotton production increased. The enslaved workforce grew. Catherine earned a reputation as a shrewd, if somewhat reclusive, plantation mistress who managed her property with uncommon efficiency. The outside world saw a widow who had defied expectations. They did not see what was happening behind the walls of the estate. Catherine continued her systematic breeding program with cold precision. After Jonathan's birth, she selected 2 more men from the enslaved population, men chosen for specific physical traits she wanted to perpetuate: height, strength, endurance, good teeth, clear eyes. She recorded everything in the cultivation journal: dates of conception, physical characteristics of each father, observations about the resulting children, notes on which pairings produced the healthiest offspring. By 1852, Catherine had given birth to 4 children, all boys, all bearing her distinctive features mixed with traits from their fathers: the high cheekbones, the pale green eyes, the auburn hair streaked with gold. She raised them in the main house until they were weaned. Then she moved them to a separate building she had constructed behind the slave quarters. She called it the nursery house. It was cleaner than the regular quarters, better maintained, with proper beds and adequate food. But make no mistake, these children were not free. Catherine made their status clear from the moment they could understand language. They were told they belonged to the estate. They were told their purpose was to work and to produce more children when they came of age. They were told they could never leave because they carried the mistress's blood. This last point was crucial to Catherine's design. She wanted these children to understand they were different from the other enslaved people, not better, but bound more tightly. Their biological connection to Catherine was not a privilege, it was a chain, one that could never be broken because it was woven into their very bodies. The other enslaved people on the plantation watched this horror unfold with the helpless anguish of people who had no power to stop it. They whispered among themselves in the quarters at night. They called Catherine's children the blood-bound ones. Some of the older women prayed for deliverance. Some of the men talked quietly about escape, though the consequences of being caught were too terrible to risk. Isaac, the father of Catherine's first son, was forced to watch his child grow up as property. He was forbidden from acknowledging him as his own, forbidden from showing him any special affection. Catherine made it clear that any attempt to claim paternity would result in Isaac being sold to the deep south, separated from everyone he knew. So Isaac remained silent. He worked the fields. He endured Catherine's continued summons to the main house, and he watched his son become part of a system designed to perpetuate bondage across generations. By 1854, the first phase of Catherine's plan was complete. She had 4 sons approaching ages that would soon make them useful. The estate's finances had stabilized. The immediate threat of losing Thornhill was past. Now Catherine turned her attention to the second phase: expansion. She began purchasing young enslaved women from neighboring plantations, women in their teens and early 20s, women of bearing age. She was selective, examining them the way a farmer examines livestock, checking their teeth, testing their strength, asking their previous owners about their health and fertility. The neighbors thought Catherine was simply rebuilding her workforce after the lean years. They did not suspect her true purpose. These women were brought to Thornhill Estate and given relatively better conditions than they had experienced elsewhere: better food, lighter workloads, medical attention when needed. Catherine was protecting her investment. She needed these women healthy and capable of bearing children. And when her sons were old enough, she intended to pair them with these women. The breeding program would continue into the next generation, and the next, and the next. Catherine recorded her long-term projections in the Cultivation Journal. If each of her sons produced 4 children, and each of those children produced 4 more, within 3 generations she would have a workforce of over 60 people, all bound to Thornhill Estate by blood, all incapable of being sold because they were her descendants. She called this her legacy. She wrote those words in her journal with evident pride. I am building something that will outlast me, a living inheritance that will grow and multiply long after I am gone. Thornhill Estate will never fall into ruin, because Thornhill Estate will be sustained by my own blood. The woman saw herself as a visionary. She could not see that she was a monster.
The second generation began in 1856. Catherine's eldest son, the one she had named Jonathan, turned 9 that year. He was too young for the pairings Catherine had planned, but she was patient. She had waited this long. She could wait a few more years. In the meantime, she continued refining her system. The nursery house behind the quarters had expanded. What started as a single building was now a small compound with 3 structures. One housed the children born from Catherine's own body, another housed the young women she had purchased for future breeding. The third served as a schoolroom of sorts, though the education provided had nothing to do with reading or writing. Catherine taught these children herself. She visited the nursery compound every afternoon, spending 2 hours drilling lessons into their young minds. But these were not lessons any normal child would recognize. She taught them their place. She taught them they were different from regular enslaved people because they carried her blood. She taught them this blood was both a privilege and a permanent bond. She taught them they could never run away, because wherever they went, they would still be Thornhills, still be bound to the estate by something stronger than chains. She taught them to be grateful. Other enslaved people could be sold away from their families. They could be separated from everyone they love, but you will never be sold. You will always stay here at Thornhill. You will always be together. Is that not a blessing? The children, too young to understand the full horror of their situation, nodded obediently. They called her Mistress Mother. Catherine insisted on this title, not just mistress, not mother, both words combined, a constant reminder of the dual relationship that defined their existence. She owned them. She had created them.
They belonged to her in ways that other enslaved people did not belong to their owners. The regular enslaved population watched these lessons with growing dread. They saw what Catherine was building, a system designed to make bondage feel natural, inevitable, even desirable. She was not just enslaving bodies, she was trying to enslave minds, to make these children believe that freedom was not even a possibility worth considering. Some of the older enslaved people tried to counter Catherine's teachings when they could. Whispered conversations in the quarters at night, stories about the North where black people lived free, reminders that bondage was wrong, no matter what the mistress said. But these counter lessons were dangerous. Catherine had informants throughout the plantation, enslaved people who reported back to her in exchange for small privileges, an extra ration of food, a lighter workload, protection from the overseer's whip. Fear and suspicion poisoned relationships in the quarters. People did not know who they could trust. The community that might have supported resistance was fractured by Catherine's deliberate design. By 1858, Catherine's eldest son Jonathan was 11 years old. He had grown into a serious, quiet boy who rarely smiled. He had his mother's green eyes and high cheekbones, but his skin was darker, his hair tightly curled. He knew who his father was. All the blood-bound children knew their fathers. Catherine made sure of it. But they were forbidden from acknowledging those relationships publicly. Jonathan saw Isaac working in the fields every day, saw the man who had given him life bent over cotton plants, back aching, hands calloused. And Jonathan was not allowed to call him father, not allowed to embrace him, not allowed to show any sign that they were connected by anything more than shared bondage. This was another part of Catherine's design. She wanted these children to feel isolated, connected only to her and to each other. If they formed strong bonds with the regular enslaved population, they might develop solidarity. They might begin to question the special status Catherine had assigned them. They might realize they had more in common with other enslaved people than with the mistress who claimed to be their mother. So Catherine kept them separate. The nursery compound had its own routines, its own schedules. The blood-bound children rarely interacted with the larger community, except under controlled circumstances. They were being raised in a bubble designed to produce obedient workers who would never dream of freedom, because they had been taught since birth that freedom was impossible for people like them. Here is something I want you to consider. How do you break a person so completely that they police their own bondage? Catherine was not just using violence, though violence was certainly part of her system. She was using psychology, identity, bond families turned into chains. Is this not one of the most insidious forms of evil? Tell me what you think in the comments. 1860 changed everything. Not at Thornhill Estate, not yet. But in the wider world, forces were gathering that would eventually tear Catherine's careful system apart. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November. Southern states began discussing secession. By February of 1861, 7 states had left the Union, and the Confederate States of America had been formed. Georgia seceded on January 19, 1861. War came in April. Catherine followed these developments with growing anxiety. She was not particularly political. She cared little about states' rights or federal overreach, or any of the abstract principles men invoked to justify their positions. What she cared about was Thornhill Estate and the legacy she had spent 14 years building. War threatened everything. If the Confederacy lost, slavery itself might be abolished. Catherine's entire system depended on the legal framework that allowed her to own human beings. Without that framework, her blood-bound children would be free. Her carefully constructed dynasty would collapse. She began making contingency plans. The first was financial. She converted as much of her liquid assets as possible into gold coins, which she hid in various locations around the property. Paper currency might become worthless, land might be confiscated, but gold would always have value. The second contingency was physical. She decided to hide the most valuable part of her legacy, the children themselves. Thornhill Estate had a basement beneath the main house. It had originally been used for storage, a cool space to keep preserved foods and wine. Catherine ordered it expanded and reinforced. She had the walls lined with brick. She installed heavy iron doors with locks that could only be opened from outside. She told the overseer this was a shelter in case of invasion, a place to protect valuables and important documents if Union troops swept through Georgia. The overseer believed her. By the summer of 1862, the basement had been transformed into a hidden living space. Catherine had beds installed, a water supply, storage for food, candles and oil lamps, chamber pots and basic sanitation. It looked like a bunker designed to weather a siege. In reality, it was a prison, designed to preserve Catherine's legacy even if the Confederacy fell. Catherine began moving the blood-bound children into the basement gradually. First for short periods, she called safety drills, then for longer stretches. By 1863, the children were spending more time underground than above. There were 17 of them by then. Catherine's 4 sons, now ranging from age 11 to 15, and 13 others, the first children of the second generation, products of the pairings Catherine had arranged between her eldest sons and the enslaved women she had purchased. Yes, you understood that correctly. Catherine had begun breeding her own sons with enslaved women when the boys reached puberty, 12 and 13 years old, children themselves forced to produce more children, more blood-bound workers for Thornhill Estate. The 13 younger children in that basement ranged from newborn to 4 years old, infants and toddlers, some still nursing. All of them carrying Catherine's bloodline, all of them destined for the same fate as their fathers. Catherine visited the basement every day. She continued her lessons even underground, teaching the children their place, reminding them why they must stay.
November 1864. Sherman's march to the sea had begun. 60,000 Union soldiers cut a path of destruction 60 miles wide across Georgia. They burned plantations, freed enslaved people, tore up railroad tracks, and twisted them around trees. Burke County lay directly in their path. Catherine heard the army approaching for 2 days before they arrived. Distant cannon fire, columns of smoke rising from neighboring estates, refugees streaming down the roads with whatever possessions they could carry. She gathered the overseers and house servants, gave instructions, maintain calm, do not resist, let the Yankees take what they want and leave. Then she went to the basement. 23 children now lived in that underground prison. The 17 from before, plus 6 more born in the past year. The youngest was only 3 months old. The eldest, her son Jonathan, was now 17. Catherine locked the iron doors from outside. She told the children to remain absolutely silent. No crying, no talking, no movement that might alert the soldiers above. "I will come back for you," she promised through the doors. "Stay quiet, and I will come back." Then she returned to the main house to wait. The soldiers of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry arrived at Thornhill Estate on November 23, 1864. They expected resistance. They found none. Catherine greeted them on the front portico, calm and composed, every inch the dignified Southern widow. She answered their questions politely, offered them food and water, made no attempt to hide the enslaved workers in the fields, knowing liberation was inevitable. The soldiers freed everyone they found. 34 men and women walked off Thornhill Estate that day, heading toward the Union lines and whatever uncertain future awaited them. Among them was Isaac. Before he left, he approached the commanding officer, a captain named William Hendricks. He spoke quietly, glancing back at the main house where Catherine watched from a window. He told the captain about the basement. He told him about the children hidden underground. He told him about the iron doors that only locked from outside. Captain Hendricks did not believe him at first. The story was too monstrous. But Isaac insisted. He described the location, the hidden entrance beneath the back stairs, the heavy locks Catherine carried on a chain around her neck. The captain sent 6 men to investigate. They found the entrance exactly where Isaac described. They found the locks. They called for tools to break through. When the iron doors finally swung open, the soldiers stood frozen in the doorway. Their lanterns illuminated a scene none of them would ever forget. 23 children huddled in the darkness, pale faces squinting against the sudden light. The youngest wailing from hunger. The eldest, a girl of 13, standing protectively in front of the smaller ones. All of them bearing the same distinctive features, high cheekbones, pale green eyes, auburn hair streaked with gold. "Who are you?" Captain Hendricks asked, his voice unsteady. The 13-year-old girl answered, "We are the mistress's legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Captain Hendricks was a veteran of 2 years of brutal warfare. He had seen men torn apart by artillery. He had walked through fields carpeted with corpses. He thought nothing could shock him anymore. He was wrong. The soldiers carried the children out of that basement into daylight many of them had not seen in months. They wrapped them in blankets, fed them, tried to comfort them. But the children did not understand they were being rescued. They cried for Mistress Mother. They begged to go back underground where it was safe. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that freedom itself terrified them. Catherine was arrested within the hour. She showed no remorse. When Captain Hendricks confronted her with what they had found, she responded with cold defiance. "Those children are my property and my blood. You have no right to take them from me. I created them. They belong to Thornhill Estate." She was still claiming ownership of human beings while Union soldiers led her in chains. Military records indicate Catherine Thornhill was transported to a federal detention facility in Savannah. What happened to her after that remains unclear. Some accounts suggest she died of typhoid fever in 1865. Others claim she was quietly released after the war and lived out her days in obscurity somewhere in Alabama. Her cultivation journal was discovered hidden in her bedroom. It was entered into evidence and eventually archived with other documents from the occupation. For over a century, it gathered dust in military storage, too disturbing for anyone to examine closely. The 23 children posed an agonizing problem for Union authorities. They had no legal identities, no family to claim them except each other, no understanding of life outside Thornhill Estate. The conditioning Catherine had imposed ran deep. Some of the older children never fully escaped it. They spent their lives struggling with the belief that they were somehow different, somehow bound in ways other freed people were not. But they survived. They built lives in the chaotic years of Reconstruction. Some stayed in Georgia, others scattered across the South and beyond. They married, had children of their own, children born free, unburdened by Catherine's twisted legacy. Isaac helped raise several of the youngest. He finally claimed Jonathan as his son. The relationship between them was complicated, damaged by years of enforced silence. But they tried. That was all anyone could do. Thornhill Estate itself was seized by federal authorities and eventually sold for unpaid taxes. The main house burned under mysterious circumstances in 1871. Today, nothing remains except foundation stones hidden in a Georgia pine forest. But the bloodline survived. Descendants of those 23 children are alive today. Most have no idea where they came from. The story was too painful for their ancestors to pass down. It was buried, like the basement itself, hidden away from a world that might not understand. Until now. This is why history matters. Not the sanitized version taught in classrooms, but the real history. The stories hidden in confidential military records and forgotten archives. The secrets people tried to bury because the truth was too terrible to face.